You're sitting at your desk, flicking through your social media feed. Then you spot a story, a veteran's experience that strikes you straight to the heart. You may have heard of her before, or maybe this is the first time, but once you see it, you can't ignore it. There's something about it that demands your attention. She's a woman who served honorably in one of the most demanding units of the US military, a woman who put her life on the line, who sacrificed everything for her country. Yet no one could have guessed the pain she endured in the years after. Her name is Jessica. She joined the army at 18, driven by a sense of duty. It wasn't for glory, fame, or recognition. Those things were secondary. What Jessica sought was the chance to serve, to give something back. She spent years training, learning, and eventually serving in active combat zones. She fought, bled, and saw the horrors of war firsthand. But when she returned home, she discovered something that shocked her. Something worse than any enemy she had faced. It wasn't the battlefield that would break her, but the callousness of the world that was supposed to welcome her back. You can't even imagine the challenges she faced, the feeling of being invisible, dismissed as if her sacrifice had no value. It started small, almost imperceptible. The comments, the looks, the awkward silences when people learned of her service. As if her service didn't mean anything anymore. Maybe it was because she was a woman in a male-dominated field, or maybe it was the fact that she wasn't one of the veterans that the public adores. Whatever the reason, Jessica felt the sting every time she tried to reintegrate into civilian life. Her story is not unique, though. Veterans across the country, especially women, face this unspoken discrimination, this indifference to their struggles. It's easy to dismiss someone when they aren't wearing their uniform anymore, when they don't fit the stereotype of a heroic soldier. That's what Jessica faced every day. She wasn't a statistic, but to others, she might as well have been. The world had forgotten what she had done, and she felt it. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. It was a simple visit to a local veterans event, just a chance for Jessica to connect with others who understood what it was like. The kind of people who had lived through similar experiences, who might share her pain and help her heal. She hoped it would be a place where she could feel at home again. She was wrong. It was supposed to be a ceremony to honor the veterans, old and new. A chance for recognition, for the crowd to express their gratitude. But when Jessica arrived, her presence was met with a coldness that pierced her heart. It wasn't outright hostile. No one screamed, no one shouted, but the disrespect, the undercurrent of disdain, was palpable. As she stood in line waiting to be called up with the other veterans, she could feel the whispers. They were subtle at first, just a few murmured words here and there. But as the minutes dragged on, the weight of it all became unbearable. Jessica had served in one of the most intense combat zones, had seen things no one should ever have to witness. Yet the people here, the very ones who should understand, looked at her as if she was nothing more than a name on a roster. No one cared. No one acknowledged the years of training, the blood, sweat, and tears she had poured into her service. And when it was her turn to step up to the front of the room, the reactions were worse than she could have imagined. She heard one of the organizers, a middle-aged man who wore a lapel pin with the flag of her country, ask another veteran, "Is she really one of us?" The question, though quiet, was loud enough for her to hear. She didn't have to ask what he meant. She knew. It was the kind of look, the kind of question, that made her feel as if her sacrifice wasn't worthy of their recognition. She had already been made to feel invisible by those around her, but now here, among her supposed peers, she was less than invisible. She was an outsider. The other veterans there, the ones with the loudest voices, the ones who held the most sway, didn't seem to care. They didn't bother to look in her direction, let alone offer a kind word. She was a woman, and that made her somehow different, somehow lesser in their eyes. You can see how it would sting. The very people who should have understood her the most were the ones who treated her as if her service was unimportant, unworthy of celebration. It wasn't just the lack of acknowledgement. It wasn't just the way the crowd had ignored her. It was the sharp sense of being diminished, the feeling that somehow her service didn't matter as much as that of her male counterparts. But it wasn't just the men, it was the women too. It seemed everyone, in one way or another, had decided that she wasn't the right kind of veteran. She wasn't one of those whose story fit neatly into a box. And then, as the ceremony ended, it became clear that the humiliation wasn't just about the lack of respect. No, it went deeper than that. As people began to leave, one man approached her, someone who was a known veteran advocate, someone who often spoke at events like this. He was the kind of guy who always wore his Veterans for Life t-shirt, who was often hailed as a spokesperson for the cause. He had an air of authority, one that immediately made Jessica feel small. Without even greeting her, he looked her up and down and muttered, "I don't know why you're even here. You don't look like a real soldier." She froze. The words cut deep, but she didn't say anything. What could she say? Her heart sank, and she turned to leave, the weight of the humiliation threatening to crush her. Her service, her years of fighting for freedom, her sacrifice for the very country she loved, none of it mattered to him. None of it mattered to anyone. As she stepped into the parking lot, she didn't feel like a veteran. She didn't feel like someone who had been part of something bigger than herself. No, she felt like an imposter, like a ghost who had been cast aside by the very people who should have had her back. It was a feeling that would stay with her for a long time. And yet, as she walked to her car, something inside her began to shift. Maybe it was the tears threatening to fall. Maybe it was the anger, the fire that had ignited in her chest. But whatever it was clear. This wouldn't be the end. She wasn't done yet. She would prove them wrong. She would make them see. Jessica knew she couldn't let this humiliation define her. But at that moment, all she could think about was the staggering isolation, the crushing weight of being overlooked by the very system that should have embraced her. You think back to how everything was about to fade away. The quiet, the disrespect, the humiliation that had left Jessica broken, questioning her worth. But what you didn't know, what neither she nor the crowd anticipated, was that an unexpected hero was about to step in and turn everything upside down. It started with a phone call. One simple, unexpected phone call that Jessica had no way of anticipating. She had spent the following days after the ceremony in a daze, replaying everything over and over in her mind. The sting of the remarks, the cold shoulder from her fellow veterans, the look on the man's face when he dismissed her as not a real soldier, it was all consuming. It was easy to think she was just another statistic, just another forgotten woman in a sea of veterans who had been overlooked. The world had forgotten her, and it felt like she had no way to turn it around. But then one morning, while sitting at her kitchen table nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something about it stirred a curiosity in her. She debated whether or not to pick up, but eventually she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice still tight with the weight of everything that had happened. "Jessica, it's Governor Lee. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Governor Lee?" What on earth could the governor want with her? There was a pause before the voice on the other end spoke again, much softer this time. "I saw what happened at that ceremony. I've heard your story, and I want to do something about it. I can't let this go on any longer. You deserve to be recognized." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Jessica wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. She had expected a call from a friend or someone who shared her pain, but the governor of her state. The very man who had the power to change things, to make her voice heard? It seemed impossible. Was it real? "Jessica, I know it's hard and I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that we see you, and I want to publicly honor you for your service. I need you to come to a special event I'm hosting next week." Jessica stood up from her chair, suddenly feeling lightheaded. Her heart raced as she took in what the governor was saying. She was speechless, overwhelmed by the sudden shift. For years, she had felt invisible. She had fought through every obstacle, only to be pushed aside at every turn. But now she was being recognized, not just by anyone, but by the person who had the power to make real change. The phone call ended, but the words didn't leave her mind. For the first time in so long, Jessica felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. Maybe there was a chance for others to hear it, for her to be seen, not just as a veteran, but as someone worthy of recognition and respect. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The governor's office worked quickly to arrange everything. Jessica was told to keep the details quiet, but the excitement was hard to contain. The day was set, and she had no idea what to expect. But one thing was clear. She was going to stand on that stage, her story heard by more people than she could have imagined. The twist wasn't just the governor's sudden interest. It wasn't the fact that he had reached out to her personally. It was the way he made her feel, like she wasn't just a footnote in a sea of veterans, but an integral part of the larger story. Like her pain mattered, like her sacrifice had meaning. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica believed it too. She wasn't just some woman who had been overlooked. She was someone who had earned her place in history, and now the world would know her name. The day of the event arrived faster than Jessica had expected, her mind still reeling from the phone call just a week ago. Everything felt like a blur, like a dream that was somehow becoming real. The governor had promised her recognition, but what she couldn't have predicted was how he planned to honor her. As the sun set on the small town square, people from all walks of life gathered in anticipation. Veterans, their families, community members, all stood beneath a canopy of flags, waiting for something big to happen. The air was filled with excitement, yet underneath it all, Jessica felt a deep sense of nervousness. She hadn't expected to be the center of attention. This wasn't why she had served. But now, as she stood backstage, preparing to step onto the stage, she understood that this wasn't just for her. It was for all the veterans who had gone unnoticed, whose stories had been ignored. Jessica adjusted the sleeves of her blouse and ran her fingers through her hair. She was trying to calm the storm inside her, but the truth was, she had no idea what was about to unfold. Her mind kept flashing back to the ceremony days earlier, the cruel words from that so-called veteran advocate, the feeling of being ignored. It was hard to shake it off, to shake off the humiliation. But now it was time for something different. The governor stepped onto the stage first, his presence commanding attention. The crowd hushed as he spoke, and his words were filled with passion. "We gather here today to honor those who have served our nation, to the men and women who fought not for fame, not for fortune, but for our freedom. Among us is one such woman, one whose courage, sacrifice, and dedication cannot be forgotten. Jessica, please come forward." Jessica's breath hitched in her throat as the spotlight turned toward her. It was surreal. For a brief moment, she couldn't move. But then, something inside her pushed her forward. She walked onto the stage, trying to steady her breathing, but her legs felt like jelly beneath her. The governor greeted her with a firm handshake, his eyes filled with warmth. "We are honored to have you here today, Jessica. Your service to this country deserves to be recognized, no longer in silence, but in the light of truth." The applause was unexpected, not just from the crowd, but from the veterans in the audience. Jessica could feel their eyes on her, their approval echoing in the air. This wasn't like the cold reception she had received at the ceremony just a few days ago. This was different. She had not been dismissed. She had not been ignored. She had been seen. The governor continued, speaking of Jessica's service with admiration. Her bravery in combat and her dedication to her brothers and sisters in arms have been unmatched. Today, we give her the respect she deserves. Then he turned to present her with a Medal of Honor, one that symbolized not just her individual achievements, but the collective recognition of all women veterans who had been overlooked for far too long. The weight of the medal on her chest felt heavy, but in the best way. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of something greater: recognition, respect, and justice. As the governor placed the medal around her neck, the crowd erupted in applause. Jessica blinked away the tears threatening to fall. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Not just for herself, but for every woman, every veteran who had ever been overlooked or belittled. As she stood there in the center of the stage, something shifted in the crowd. People were no longer whispering, no longer dismissing her. They were clapping, cheering, acknowledging the sacrifice she had made. The world was finally seeing her for who she truly was, a hero. And in that moment, Jessica knew she had not just been honored for her service, she had been given something far more valuable: her dignity. The world had been reminded of what she and so many others had done, and now they couldn't ignore it. The governor didn't stop there, though. After the ceremony, he took the time to personally thank Jessica, speaking to her with a sincerity that went beyond politics. "I hope you understand," he said. "This is not just about a medal. This is about us acknowledging the people who have given everything for our country, those who have been forgotten for far too long. We need to do better, Jessica, and you've inspired me to make sure we do." Jessica left the event with her head held high. She wasn't just leaving a ceremony, she was leaving a moment of change. She had been honoured, yes, but she had also been the catalyst for something bigger. The governor's actions spoke louder than any speech could. He had proven that there was more to the story than just the soldiers who fit the mould. The applause, the respect, the acknowledgement, it was everything she had dreamed of but never thought she'd receive. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was the turning point. Jessica was no longer a woman whose service went unnoticed. She had become the symbol of change, of recognition for every silent, forgotten veteran. The evening after the event, Jessica sat quietly in her living room, processing the whirlwind of emotions that had come with the governor's public acknowledgement. Her thoughts were still clouded, the adrenaline from the ceremony beginning to settle. What had started as a private pain, something she carried alone for so many years, had now become a public rallying cry, a call for change. She didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Yes, she'd been honoured, but it wasn't just about the medal. It wasn't just about the applause. It was the ripple effect that had started, the message that went beyond her story. As the news spread of the governor's recognition of Jessica, it wasn't just her fellow veterans who were moved. It was ordinary citizens, people who had never served, people who had no direct connection to the military. Yet they too felt the weight of her journey, felt the injustice of her humiliation, and were inspired by her resilience. Social media was alive with messages of support. Hashtags like "Honour Her Service" and "Had Women Veterans Matter" flooded platforms. Veterans, both male and female, shared their own stories of being overlooked, their experiences of fighting for recognition in a world that had too often forgotten them. But it wasn't just veterans. Teachers, students, parents, and even children shared their thoughts. They posted photos of Jessica's ceremony, along with messages of gratitude and admiration. The ripple had become a wave. Jessica had no idea how much her story would inspire others. She had always thought of herself as just one veteran, one woman among many who had experienced similar struggles. But now she realized that her voice had been the spark that ignited something much larger. People who had never met her were standing up, sharing their own struggles, demanding that women veterans receive the respect they deserved. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. Veterans' organizations took notice as well. They began to speak out more loudly about the need for greater representation of women in the military community, the need for equal recognition of their sacrifices. Jessica's story was being used as a tool to call attention to the issues women faced in the armed forces, both during their service and after they returned home. It wasn't enough to just acknowledge their contributions. It was time for the system to change, to adapt, and to recognize the unique challenges they faced. As the days passed, Jessica was contacted by news outlets and organizations that wanted to interview her, to share her story with a wider audience. But it wasn't the interviews that she found most meaningful. It was the messages. The hundreds, maybe thousands of veterans, particularly women, who reached out to her, thanking her for sharing her truth. They spoke of their own struggles, of their own quiet battles for respect and recognition. Some had left the military long ago, while others were still serving, but they all shared a common thread. They felt invisible. Jessica didn't set out to be a symbol of change. She hadn't wanted to become an advocate. But something about the outpouring of support stirred something deep within her. She knew she couldn't walk away from this. If she did, then the momentum would fade. If she stayed silent now, then the cause she had sparked would die with the fleeting moments of applause. She began to speak out more, not just for herself, but for all those women who had gone unnoticed. She joined panels, attended conferences, and spoke at local schools. She became a vocal advocate for the recognition of women veterans, working with organisations to push for policy changes and greater visibility. The attention, though, wasn't without its challenges. Jessica found herself facing pushback from some corners of the veteran community, those who were reluctant to embrace the idea that women could be just as capable, just as deserving of recognition as their male counterparts. But for every person who dismissed her, there were countless others who stood by her side, who stood up and said, "No more. We can't let this go on." There was one particularly poignant moment that stands out in her journey. At a town hall meeting, a fellow veteran, one who had been a long-time advocate for military personnel, stood up and apologized to Jessica. "I've been one of those people," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't see you. I didn't understand what you went through. I'm sorry." It was an unexpected turn, and it touched Jessica deeply. This wasn't just about her fight anymore. It was about a shift in the way the world saw women in the military, the way society recognized their worth. It was about people acknowledging that their sacrifices were just as important, just as valuable. Jessica realized that her fight, though sparked by personal humiliation, had grown into something bigger than herself. It was no longer just about one woman's struggle for respect. It was about making sure that future generations of women veterans would not face the same marginalization. And that was something worth fighting for. She had become a voice, a symbol of strength, a reminder that no one, no matter their gender or background, should ever be made to feel invisible for their service. The ripple that had started with one phone call had now turned into a movement, a call for justice, recognition, and equality. And Jessica, the woman who had once felt discarded, now stood at the forefront of a new era for women in the military. Weeks passed, and Jessica's life began to change in ways she had never expected. The public recognition, the media attention, and the support from people across the country didn't just affect her. It affected the community around her. People who had once been quiet in their support of veterans, people who hadn't truly understood the struggles that women in the military faced, were now vocal in their support. It was as if Jessica's story had woken something in everyone. The need to acknowledge the unspoken truths about the military, about veterans, and especially about women who had served. It wasn't just in the media or in interviews where the ripple effect was felt. It began to affect local governments, local businesses, and schools. Veterans organizations started changing their approach, recognizing that the veteran community was more diverse than they had previously acknowledged. Local businesses started offering discounts and benefits specifically for female veterans, recognizing their service in ways they hadn't before. Jessica's story became a touchstone for change. One morning, she was invited to meet with a local high school to speak about her experiences. The students, many of whom had never considered the challenges veterans faced, were inspired by her words. Jessica didn't hold back. She talked about her service, the obstacles she faced, and the way society had ignored her for so long. But she also talked about resilience, about the power of finding your voice when the world tries to silence you. "I want you to remember," she said to the students, "that you have the power to change things. You have the power to stand up for what's right, even when it feels like no one's listening. I was once where you are, trying to make a difference in the world. And you can, too." The students, many of whom had never heard a woman veteran's story before, left the room changed. It wasn't just about hearing the story. It was about being inspired to act, to be the change, to not let the injustices they witnessed go unnoticed. That day was a pivotal moment. Jessica realized that her story was not just hers. It was a tool, a message that could ignite something far greater than just one voice. And she wasn't alone. There were countless others who had been fighting for recognition, for equality, for the respect they deserved. Jessica's recognition had simply brought their voices to the forefront. As the weeks turned into months, Jessica found herself at the center of a growing movement. She attended more rallies, more panels, and more interviews. She became a beacon of hope for women who had been marginalized in the military community. Her story had given them permission to speak up, to share their own experiences without fear of judgment or ridicule. And more importantly, it had reminded the world that the fight for equality in the military was far from over. But it wasn't just women who were impacted. Jessica's story had also sparked a larger conversation about the treatment of all veterans, regardless of their gender. Veterans who had once felt forgotten began to speak out about the systemic issues they faced in accessing healthcare, securing benefits, and getting the support they needed after returning home. Jessica's visibility had brought these struggles into the spotlight, and the world was starting to listen. The military, too, began to take notice. While there was no immediate policy change, there was a shift in the tone of the conversation. Veterans' organizations began to include more women in their leadership roles. Female veterans, who had often felt pushed to the margins, were now sitting at the table, having their voices heard. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Progress that had been long overdue. As Jessica looked back on everything she had gone through, from the humiliation at the ceremony to the governor's recognition and the wave of support that followed, she realized something profound. The transformation wasn't just in the external world, it was in herself too. She had gone from feeling invisible, forgotten, and silenced to becoming a powerful advocate for change. Her courage, her willingness to stand up, had not only changed her own life, it had changed the lives of countless others. And this change wasn't fleeting. It wasn't a momentary burst of recognition followed by silence. No, the impact of her story, the way it had inspired others to speak out, had created a lasting shift. It wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about the power of stories, the importance of voices being heard, and the undeniable truth that the struggles of veterans, especially women, could no longer be ignored. Jessica continued to speak, continued to advocate, but now she did so with a sense of purpose. The fight for recognition wasn't over. It had only just begun. And with each new voice that joined the chorus, with each new person who stepped up to say, "I too have served and I too deserve recognition," Jessica knew that this movement had the potential to change the landscape of military recognition for generations to come. But there was one final quiet moment of reflection that Jessica cherished. One evening, sitting on the porch of her home, she looked out at the sunset, a sense of calm washing over her. She thought about everything she had been through, the pain, the humiliation, the recognition, and she knew, deep down, that this journey wasn't just about fighting for herself. It was about fighting for all the silent veterans, the ones whose stories had been forgotten, whose sacrifices had been invisible. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jessica realized that she had become more than just a symbol. She had become the beginning of something bigger than herself, a community transformed.